Today, we're going to be undertaking a very structured and sensitive analysis of these sources related to the case of U.S. Army Specialist Vanessa Guillén. This is a story that really illuminates some profound challenges, within a major institution, all set against the backdrop of an unimaginable personal tragedy. Our goal here is to provide you, the listener, with a clear, a comprehensive, and a factually grounded recounting of the timeline, the evidence, and the intense institutional critique that followed.
It is so essential that we approach this exploration with the seriousness and really the respect that this case demands. Vanessa Guillén was a young woman, a soldier with her entire life ahead of her, and her service was just so tragically cut short.
Can you give us some of the basic background?
Of course. She was born on September 30th, 1999 in Houston, Texas. She was a native Latina American woman who enlisted in the U.S. Army back in 2018. And the events we're focusing on, they unfolded while she was stationed at one of the Army's largest installations, Fort Hood, which is located near Guillen, Texas.
Okay, so our mission today is to methodically trace the facts that are provided in the source materials. We'll start by establishing the atmosphere of fear she was reportedly experiencing right before her disappearance on April 22, 2020.
And from there, we'll chart the initial days of the search.
Right. Then we'll detail the discovery of her remains, identify the key individuals involved in the crime and the cover-up, and then conclude by examining the highly critical and powerful public reaction to how the Army handled the investigation.
The core facts of this case are, they're heartbreakingly simple, but at the same time, devastatingly complex in what they imply. A young soldier went missing from her post at Fort Hood and was later found deceased.
And what really stands out, and what frames this entire discussion, is that her family was suspicious from the very beginning.
From the outset, yes. Their belief, which they articulated very consistently and very loudly, was that her disappearance was, directly linked to previous sexual harassment she had reportedly endured while serving. And they also felt that the U.S. Army had failed, that it failed to dedicate sufficient attention and resources to solve her case.
That sense of institutional abandonment, it really became a central conflict, didn't it?
It did. It's really at the heart of the entire story.
Okay, so let's unpack this and start not with the crime itself, but with the context, with what the sources reveal about Vanessa Guillén before April of 2020. We know she was 20 years old, stood about 5 feet 3 inches tall, and she was, by all accounts, fully committed to her service at Fort Hood.
Yes, but the foundational detail here, the one that really foreshadows the tragedy to come, is the serious apprehension she felt about her own personal security while stationed there.
And that detail is just so crucial.
It is, because it transforms the narrative from, say, a simple missing person case into one that's rooted in an alleged systemic failure. She wasn't just a soldier. She was a soldier who felt unsafe within the very environment she was supposed to trust most. The sources are clear that she confided in her mother, Gloria Guillen, about this hostile and frankly dangerous environment she felt trapped in.
And the allegations she was making were specific. They pointed toward a person in a position of authority over her.
Yes, she identified a sergeant who she said was actively contributing to this uncomfortable and unsafe situation. It wasn't just a general unease, it was targeted distress.
And what was the nature of that misconduct?
The sources are very precise here. The behavior she reported went far beyond typical harassment. They included persistent stalking and surveillance. And what is particularly shocking and just profoundly violating is the specific mention of surveillance during her private activities, specifically while she was showering.
That's horrifying.
It is. And that detail, it highlights such a severe breakdown in personal security and privacy in a place where it should be, sacrosanct. This type of intimate intrusion would naturally fuel deep apprehension and fear in anyone.
And this raises an immediate and, frankly, a very troubling question about the channels that are available for reporting these kinds of high-stakes violations within a military hierarchy.
Exactly. When her mother learned of these specific acts of alleged stalking and surveillance, she did what any mother would do. She offered to take the steps necessary to file a formal report against the soldier causing this distress.
But Vanessa hesitated.
She did, and this is where the institutional culture becomes so critically relevant. Mrs. Guillen's primary concern, according to the sources, was a desire to protect her mother from potential repercussions.
Repercussions for reporting a superior officer.
Yes. If a formal complaint was lodged against a ranking soldier, this desire to shield her family, coupled with her statement that she would resolve the situation independently, powerfully underscores the perceived risks of speaking out.
When reporting a crime or harassment feels more dangerous than just remaining silent, That signals a huge structural problem within the organization.
A fundamental problem.
So she was trying to navigate this deeply hostile situation on her own, while also dealing with other complex interpersonal dynamics at the base. Let's shift our focus now to the individuals the sources identify as the key suspects in her disappearance and subsequent murder. There are two people whose names appear again and again.
The primary suspect identified in the investigation was Aaron David Robinson. He was also a soldier, a specialist stationed at Fort Hood.
Okay, and what was the connection there?
Well, the sources reveal a specific high-stakes conflict that predated the crime. It's reported that Guillen had the intention of filing a formal report against Mr. Robinson for adultery.
Now, for listeners who might be unfamiliar with military law, the term adultery might not sound like a major issue, but under the Uniform Code of Military Justice, the UCMJ, it's a very different story.
Precisely. It's far from minor. Under Article 134 of the UCMJ, adultery is classified as a punishable offense.
And what does that mean in a practical sense?
In the military context, this isn't just seen as a moral failing. It's treated as conduct unbecoming of an officer or enlisted member, something that's capable of undermining what they call good order and discipline. So, if Robinson were formally charged and convicted of adultery, it could have had significant repercussions for his military career. Demotion, forfeiture of pay, or even a punitive discharge. So this high-stakes threat, it gives him a very clear and potentially volatile motive for trying to silence or preempt Guillen's report against him. It really elevates a personal conflict into a professional crisis for the suspect.
And there was a second individual whose involvement became critical, particularly to the cover-up.
That's right, Cecily Ann Aguilar.
And she was identified as Aaron David Robinson's girlfriend.
Yes. And as the timeline of the investigation unfolds, we see her role shift from maybe a peripheral acquaintance to a direct co-conspirator in the deliberate, calculated effort to conceal the crime after the fact.
Okay, that sets the stage. Let's move into the immediate timeline now, covering the critical weeks of April and May 2020. This is the moment where the facts concerning her alleged harassment unfortunately culminate in tragedy. Let's establish the critical date, April 22nd.
April 22, 2020. This is the day Vanessa Guillén vanished. The sources confirm she was last seen in a parking lot at Fort Hood, but what the subsequent investigation revealed, according to law enforcement, is the shocking immediacy of the crime.
She was killed that same day.
The sources state that she was killed that very day, and the level of violence is evident in the fact that a hammer was cited as the weapon used. The speed and the brutality of the alleged murder indicate a crime of intense rage or maybe panic, which was then followed very quickly by extreme efforts at concealment.
And the suspects immediately moved to cover up the crime. This wasn't something they decided to do later.
Not at all. The detailed allegations provided by law enforcement in the source material show this was not a quick effort, but a sustained one. They alleged that the suspects almost immediately took measures to destroy the evidence. They cut up and buried Guillen's remains near the Leon River.
And that location wasn't random.
No, it was strategically chosen. It's approximately 30 miles, or about 48 kilometers away from the Fort Hood base, a remote location. The act of dismemberment and burial, performed so soon after the murder, it just speaks to a cold, calculated attempt to make sure the body was never found and that the crime would remain hidden forever.
Let's track the official military response in those initial chaotic days. The Army's Criminal Investigations Command, or CID, they were brought in pretty quickly.
Yes. On April 23rd, just 24 hours after her disappearance, CID was officially notified that Private First Class Guillen was reported missing. And CID is the primary law enforcement body for the U.S. Army, so they're responsible for investigating serious felonies. The speed of that notification suggests that the initial circumstances were concerning enough that the matter was immediately elevated from, say, a simple AWOL absent without leave case.
And the search expanded quickly. It went beyond the base itself.
It did. By April 24th, we see the investigation broadening its scope. CID issued a formal missing soldier letter, and importantly, the Fort Hood Military Police issued a BD on the lookout advisory, a BLO to the surrounding civilian law enforcement agencies.
So that's Killeen, Bell County.
Exactly. A BLO is essentially an alert. It signals to police, troopers, and local agencies to actively look for a person or a vehicle. This expansion of the search indicated that investigators believe she may have left the base, either voluntarily or involuntarily.
And based on those initial investigative steps, attention turned pretty quickly toward potential persons of interest, which led to the first interview with one of the suspects.
Yes. On April 28th, that's just 6 days after the murder, SPC Robinson was interviewed by CID for the very first time. Now, the sources don't detail the content of that interview, but the fact that he was questioned so early suggests he was identified quickly as one of the last people to have seen her, or perhaps someone who had an existing conflict with her.
Tying back to the adultery threat.
Potentially, it shows the investigators were moving quickly on their initial leads.
What's so sobering to realize is that even as CID was conducting these initial interviews and issuing BELOs, the cover-up was still actively happening.
The cell phone data later provided a grim confirmation of that. On April 26th, that's 4 days after the disappearance, and 2 days before Robinson's first interview, Aguilar and Robinson are alleged to have returned to the burial site.
They went back.
They went back, and they continued the process of breaking down Guillen's body. This detail, extracted from the forensic analysis of their device data, shows an active, intentional, and ongoing attempt to destroy physical evidence, to make identification as difficult as possible. It just speaks volumes about the level of premeditation in the cover-up.
By the end of April, the case had attracted enough public attention that the Army needed to demonstrate some institutional ownership of the situation.
Absolutely. And on April 30th, the Secretary of the Army, Ryan D. McCarthy, issued a public statement. A statement from the Secretary is a significant gesture. He acknowledged the missing Private First Class Guillen, promised the Army would continue to aggressively search for her, and expressed sympathy for her family. This really signaled that the political gravity of the situation was already being recognized at the highest levels of the U.S. Army structure.
Okay, so moving into May, the investigation continued to generate critical leads, specifically focusing on physical evidence surrounding SPC Robinson.
Yes, and a critical breakthrough occurred on May 18th. 2 witnesses were interviewed who provided key testimony about Robinson's activities immediately following the disappearance. They reported seeing SPC Robinson struggling with a large, heavy object described as a tough box outside of the armory.
A tough box? What is that exactly?
It usually refers to a durable, often reinforced storage container, like a large pelican case or something similar. And this observation was vital because it linked Robinson to a plausible means of transporting remains or other evidence. It connected him physically to suspicious actions outside of his normal duties.
That sighting must have galvanized the investigators. It must have led pretty quickly to the next step, which would be gathering digital proof.
It did. The very next day, May 19th, Robinson consented to a UFED extraction on his cell phone.
And just for the listener, a UFED extraction. That's a sophisticated forensic technique.
It is. It's used by law enforcement to pull every shred of data from a mobile device. Call logs, messages, images, and, most crucially in this case, geospatial location data, GPS data. His consent was a high-stakes move, and the data yielded from this extraction ultimately provided the precise geographical breadcrumbs needed to locate the burial site. It was, in a way, the technological nail in the coffin, even if the remains themselves hadn't been found yet.
And that really sets the stage for the tragic conclusion that's outlined in the sources, covering the discovery and the suspect's final actions in June and July of 2020. So in June, the investigation began to close the net around Cecily Ann Aguilar.
The timeline shows that investigators shift toward her, yes. On June 19th, Miss Aguilar was interviewed for the first time by law enforcement. While we don't know the exact lines of inquiry from that first interview, it likely served to gauge her knowledge and potential involvement before the investigation moved into its final stages.
But the real turning point, the moment the digital evidence really paid off, came just 2 days later.
On June 21st, investigators utilized that detailed cell phone data that was extracted from both Robinson's and Aguilar's phones. This data led law enforcement officials to a specific location near the Leon River, and it aligned precisely with the alleged 30-mile distant burial location.
But they didn't find anything.
No. And this is a key detail that really speaks to the suspects' diligence in their concealment efforts. Law enforcement failed to find a body at this initial search attempt. The remains were just too deeply and carefully hidden.
So the investigation was stalled. They had all these digital clues, but they lacked the physical evidence to make an arrest.
Exactly.
And the tragic conclusion, it arrived not through an official search, but through just a purely accidental discovery on June 30th.
This is often the grim reality of these complex investigations. At approximately 1:00 p.m. on June 30th, some contractors who were working completely unrelated to the police search, they were repairing or building a fence near the Leon River, and they discovered human body parts. They immediately called law enforcement.
And CID and other agencies then converged on that site.
They did, confirming the discovery of remains that were consistent with the description of a carefully concealed body.
The finding of those remains must have forced the investigators to move very, very quickly, immediately re-interviewing the remaining suspect.
That same evening, at about 8:30 p.m., Aguilar was brought in for questioning again. And this time, faced with the undeniable discovery of the body parts, her narrative just shattered. In this interview, she confessed. She told law enforcement that SPC Robinson had confessed to her about killing a female soldier on Fort Hood.
And that was the definitive link.
It was the official definitive linkage of the crime to the main perpetrator, though Robinson himself had previously denied any involvement.
The sources detail how investigators then used Aguilar to set a trap for the main suspect.
They moved into a classic investigative tactic, the controlled call. Aguilar subsequently made a recorded, controlled telephone call to Robinson, and during this conversation, Robinson's panic and his guilt were reportedly laid bare. He stated, "Baby, they found pieces," which confirmed his immediate awareness of the news and directly implicated himself in the secret he shared with Aguilar.
And it didn't stop there.
No. Following the call, he continued to text Aguilar multiple news articles about the discovery. It showed he was tracking the investigation's momentum and realizing that the net was closing in.
The culmination of the pursuit of the primary suspect then occurred shortly after that call.
It did. When law enforcement officials approached SBC Robinson to take him into custody, following the controlled call and those incriminating texts, he somehow managed to escape confinement. A subsequent confrontation resulted in him killing himself.
Which brought an immediate and tragic end to the pursuit of the primary suspect.
And it effectively closed the door on his criminal prosecution for the murder.
So, following Robinson's death, the remaining legal steps moved swiftly to confirm the victim's identity and secure charges against the remaining co-conspirator.
That's right. On July 2nd, the FBI formally submitted a criminal complaint for Cecily Ann Aguilar, shifting the focus to her role in conspiracy and concealment. And just 3 days later, on July 5th, the remains that were discovered on June 30th were officially confirmed through forensic analysis to be those of Vanessa Guillén. And that provided the definitive, heartbreaking closure the family desperately needed regarding her fate.
As of the timeline documented in the sources, where did the legal process stand with Cecily Ann Aguilar?
As of July 6, 2020, Mrs. Aguilar was in jail, facing a series of federal charges related to tampering with evidence and conspiring to conceal the murder. Since Robinson was deceased, the case against her focused purely on that extensive cover-up operation.
This concludes the factual timeline of the crime and the immediate investigation. But now we need to transition into a segment that is arguably just as important as the timeline itself, the critical reactions and the broader institutional implications that arose from this case. What was the immediate response from Vanessa Guillén's family?
The family's response was characterized by profound grief, but also equally profound anger. They expressed in the strongest possible terms their deep dissatisfaction with the entire investigation.
And what was their main assertion?
Their main assertion, which really became the emotional anchor of the public conversation, was that the United States Army had not allocated the necessary resources or attention required for a diligent and swift inquiry into Mrs. Guillén's disappearance. This went beyond just wanting to find her. They felt the system had actively failed her, and then failed them in the search for her.
And that feeling of institutional neglect, it was channeled very forcefully by the family's legal counsel, Natalie Coam. What were the specific structural criticisms that she leveled against the Army?
Coam publicly and repeatedly criticized the Army's management of the entire affair. And her criticism wasn't focused solely on the CID investigation after the disappearance. Crucially, she faulted the institution for failing to implement sufficient measures to safeguard Miss Guillén's personal security before her disappearance.
So this goes right back to the beginning.
It connects directly back to the documented fears Vanessa had expressed, the reports of stalking, of surveillance, even in private areas like the showers. Coam's argument was that the Army knew, or at the very least should have known, that Guillen was in danger, and that the lack of protective action created the environment in which this tragedy could unfold.
And this specific case, it quickly transcended Fort Hood and the military justice system. It triggered a much wider social and political response. The public reaction was massive.
It was an immediate national outcry. The sources document numerous public protests demanding that Vanessa be found, and then later demanding justice for the systemic failures that her case represented. These demonstrations were expressions of collective outrage from the Native American community, the Latino community, and just the general public, all focused on the perceived inability of the military to protect its own people.
And this demand for accountability, it didn't just stay confined to the streets. It translated directly into high-level political discussion.
It absolutely did. The case garnered national attention. It drew comments and involvement from many celebrities and politicians. And the focus of this political discussion rapidly shifted away from just the specifics of the murder and onto a broader systemic issue: how to reduce and prevent sexual harassment and sexual violence in the armed forces.
So the Guillen case became a flashpoint.
It did. It highlighted the perceived danger and the lack of effective, confidential reporting mechanisms for service members experiencing harassment and assault. The sources indicate the push for reform centered on removing the reporting chain of command from the victim's superiors, thereby eliminating that fear of retaliation.
So if we synthesize all the facts we've traced today, we're left with a very clear, very painful narrative. A young soldier who had communicated fears regarding her safety due to reported harassment and surveillance was tragically murdered by a fellow soldier, all taking place at a major U.S. military base.
And this tragedy, it leads inexorably to these profound questions regarding the entire structure of institutional oversight, military culture, and accountability. The family's insistence that the institution was derelict is supported by the facts that Vanessa had indeed communicated her fears about an unsafe environment. The question that remains is how the military can ensure its internal systems prioritize personal safety over institutional image or, bureaucratic procedure.
So for you, the listener, we return to that detail that the sources illuminated so early on, that Vanessa Guillén feared potential repercussions for reporting the harassment and sought to protect her mother from those same risks.
That fact is, in many ways, the entire reason this case sparked national reform movements. When an individual service member believes that protecting their career or protecting their family is in an inherent conflict with ensuring their own personal safety, the structural mechanism of command and justice has fundamentally failed. The system itself becomes part of the danger.
That internal conflict, the fear of reporting, coupled with the devastating result of silence, that's what makes comprehensive, mandated reforms addressing sexual harassment and command accountability so critically necessary. It's what's needed to rebuild trust and ensure the physical safety and the professional well-being of all who serve. It requires a fundamental cultural shift within the military.
It is a profound institutional challenge that the tragedy of Vanessa Guillén illuminated for the entire nation, forcing necessary, difficult conversations about who is truly responsible for protecting those who protect us.
Thank you for joining us for this extensive exploration of the sources detailing the case of Vanessa Guillén. Our deepest sympathy remains with her family and all who continue to seek accountability and lasting change. Thanks for listening.